Hey, church family, welcome to another Q&A. Now, this one will be just a little bit different in the sense that this is going to be part of our Gift of Gab series. And so we're going to have a series of different pastors and speakers, presenters that are going to be part of this experience. And tonight, you are getting a flavor of the first pastor who is part of the series besides Pastor Randy. We are going to be interviewing tonight Joey O, who is our pastor for administration, the lead pastor for our Rooted Young Adult Professional Community. He is also an avid reader and student working on his doctorate. He is truly a good friend of mine, and I'm so excited to have him on our show. And also, we are lucky to have another Roberts with us. So Randy's gone, but another preacher who spoke tonight, if you'd like to take a look at Austin Roberts' sermon, he also spoke this weekend at our night church experience. And so you don't want to miss that. Austin is one of our intern young adult pastors in our young adult ministry. He's also a student at Fuller Theological Seminary working on his MDiv while his wife is in residency at our hospital. But we'd also like to hear from you. So where are you from? Where are you watching? We'd love to hear. So if you could take a moment in the comments box just to say, hey, I'm from Redlands. I'm from the Caribbean. I'm watching from Korea. We'd love to hear from you. So if you can take that moment to do that, we would love to hear where are you watching from right now. And it is the beginning of Friday for us here. And so I want to just first off say happy Sabbath to all of you. We're grateful at the blessing of a day to just break. And so right now, I want to invite my two good friends, Pastors Austin and Joey, on the show with us now. Hey, guys.
Hey, Philip.
Hey, Phil. Good to see you.
Now, where are you guys at right now? Where are you at?
Well, I'm at home. This is my office, my home office, where I've been broadcasting from whenever I have to broadcast.
Nice.
I am also at home, just here in Loma Linda, California, not too far from, our church right here, and happy to be here with you all.
Awesome. Hey, thank you both for joining me tonight. This is going to be shown Saturday at 2 o'clock. And so if you're going to be watching this, you will have seen a pre-recorded experience. Just with all of our schedules, we had to do it this way. Well, I just want to say hi to a few people who are watching. You guys can say hi too. It looks like we've got Eduardo from Lima, Peru watching. Eduardo, feliz sábado. We've got someone from Houston, Texas. All right, I'm going to try and say this. Rajeshwari. Oh, man, I'm so sorry if I messed that up. Greta from Grand Terrace. Hi, and welcome. And then I think this is Shemaiah watching from Charlotte, North Carolina. That's Loving Christ Through Love. He's been part of our experience online, so we're so glad you're watching. And Greta, happy Sabbath to you as well. Well, if you're tuning in, you also might know that this is a series on the gift of gab. Now, Joey, just tell us a little bit, what is this series about? Why did you come up with this in particular? And maybe why do you think this was so timely in kind of the trajectory of the world and its events today?
Yeah, actually, this is a series that we worked on and brainstormed and prayed about and prayed over way back in January. Philip is one of the preachers as well, and a bunch of us gathered together to organize this series. And we just felt that even back then, it was clear that we were having conversations, but not real conversations. We were talking at each other rather than to each other and with each other. And so it felt like an important series back then. Now, it seems even more timely that we are talking about the gift of gab, the gift of giving meaningful conversations where meaning is communicated from one person to the next.
Wow, wow. Yeah, it's interesting. I remember when you were telling me about this almost in December, and I was like, "Wow, Joey, you're really planning this far in advance, brother." And yet, it truly is a gift. You know, right now with the racial tensions, the isolation, individuals are not talking as much as they could be and should be, at least in a way that conveys meaning, as you said. So, really timely. Well, guys, I have a few questions, maybe off topic a little bit, just maybe more so about general situations as a whole. I wanted to kind of start off with some of those questions, and then we'd love to hear from our viewers as well, questions that you might have for us as a pastoral team. What are some powerful conversations that speak to you personally in Scripture? What are some conversations that are kind of speak to you, Austin? Anything in particular that you thought was a powerful conversation in Scripture?
Yeah, one conversation I think that always kind of gives me some pause when I read through it is the conversation that we have between God and Elijah up on Mount Horeb, or as it's also known, Mount Sinai. Elijah is kind of an emotional wreck, I guess you could say, at that point. I think he's angry at some level, and he's certainly dealing with despair and probably pain and loss at another level. But he and God have this conversation, and God sort of, first calms him down a little bit and then reminds him that God is God and Elijah is not. And after that moment, Elijah continues to work very hard for the kingdom. But that's always struck me because God has, such a way of being firm, but also loving and understanding what point Elijah is at in his life and being able to minister to him, in a moment for him that's probably really tough and really difficult.
Great point. I like that. Thanks so much for sharing that. Joey, do you have any conversation in particular that comes to mind from Scripture?
Well, I love that, Austin, because actually God models really good listening technique there, right? He really brings Elijah down. He allows Elijah to calm down before he communicates his message. He doesn't just pound him right away. He listens to him, he cares for his needs, he watches out for him, and then he communicates with him. What a powerful story. So I was picking between two in my mind. I think I'll go with Esther. Esther's conversation with the king is just with King Xerxes is so fascinating because she goes through this whole process, right? She goes through a process of inviting him to dinner and then inviting him to dinner again. And it's like this long drawn out conversation. And at first glance, I always thought it was sort of a waste of time because why wouldn't she just tell him right away? She's obviously his wife. She's a new wife. She probably has some pull with him. But I think she really gets human nature in the way that she draws out this conversation. She lulls Haman into sort of a calmed point, like, oh, the queen really loves me or cares about me. She's inviting me into this, and sort of sets up this conversation. So that one always fascinates me, is the Esther's conversation with King.
So you want to teach people how to kind of bring them in like a black widow, and then
yeah, sort of. I think there is some strategy when it comes to conversation. Actually, there's a author by the name of Chris Voss. He's a former FBI hostage negotiator, and he talks about tactical empathy, which he uses in hostage negotiations. And his whole point is empathy is the easiest way to get someone to tell you what they want and to be able to move them if you want to. So he talks about using empathy to get the best deal on cars and to negotiate hostages out of hostage situations. And this isn't fake empathy where you're just pretending to be empathetic. He's actually being empathetic because he knows that communication doesn't work unless you're empathetic to the other person.
Wow. Wow, that's good. That's really good. I mean, when you think about some of the conversations that should and could be had in a church setting, I asked this of Pastor Randy last week, that should happen that maybe are not happening. What do both of you think might be some of those conversations that could and should happen that might be awkward as a denomination, or even locally, simply as the Loma Linda University Church, that you think we should be having that potentially are not?
Yeah, that's a hard one. Austin, you want to go?
Sure. I suppose I can take a stab at it. Philip, like you said, there are probably many conversations we could have as a local community and as a global community in this church. One thing that I think I've talked a bit about before in my own personal circle of friends is the fact that we don't always do, oh, sorry, my dog is barking here at my cat. We don't always do a great job at lament. We don't talk about our longings and our losses and our sadnesses as a community very often. In church, we sing praise songs or happy music, which is a good thing. We should praise and we should be happy. But at times, or many times, I guess I should say, our churches are full of people who are suffering from, a variety of different things. And we're not always doing a great job at being sad with our people. And so I think that might be a conversation we could have about lamenting our longings and losses with one another.
Wow, that's a great one. I love that. We don't think about lament very often, do we? Yeah. Pastor Joey and I happen to be part of a initiative, which even Austin got to take part in a little bit, with Fuller Theological Seminary. And that's the practice we've chosen as a young adult community to try and not only model, but teach and experience over this next year, is lament itself. One of the first things we're going to do as a young adult community at the end of the month when we gather for the very first time is just hear the stories of longing and loss that our church members have experienced. And it's going to be a night of just listening to our people. And so, Austin, that is so rich, man. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. And I think people sort of shy away from lament because it seems like a downer, right? Lament sounds like something that you would weep at. And who wants to be the guy that brings up their losses to everybody? And yet there is something cathartic about sharing your loss and then having someone hear you and respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Joey, any conversations you think are missing in our church today, locally and even globally?
I don't know if it's a missing conversation, but one that I would love to have is what the future holds for our church, for our Adventist church, for the Christian church. Actually, the way that we practice church is not really that old, having a preacher come up and preach a sermon, and the format that we follow that all churches typically follow, although we have some variations of it. And that being seen as church, it's a worship service, but the worship service is church. When people say I'm going to church, they mean I'm going to the worship service.
Yeah.
And yet during Jesus's time, that's not what church was, right? That's not the way that they did church. So we can see that though the format is just one way of following Jesus, or complementing the way that we follow Jesus. So is it possible that in the future that's going to look a little bit different? And if so, what will that look like? And how will the church continue to minister the timeless gospel of Jesus in a changing context?
Yeah, absolutely. Great point, Joey. I want to just kind of go to a few of our listeners here just for a moment. Greta is watching, and she's saying people in India can lament during losses. They're more transparent. I think that during times of loss, when it's like a death, that's when we almost start to see the real spirit of hardship that emerges from someone when tears come down their face. It's almost like unless someone dies, it's hard pressed for some people to cry. Other people cry a little bit more, but yeah, absolutely. Sheila writes, I think lamenting used to be a key to support groups that churches used to have, but it's been harder to keep active. It was the safe place to share loss and sorrow. Absolutely. Hey, before we go to our next question, Jeff Hacker here asks, when will our church open? Joey, you're the man on this one. You've been tasked with our reopening kind of chairman. So tell us a little bit about that.
Actually, it's a whole team that's working through this together. Members of the pastoral staff, lay leaders that are navigating this. Yeah, our church is already starting to gather in person. There's small groups that are gathering in person already. And if there's any ministry groups that want to get together, they just need to contact their supporting pastor and they'll let them know. The larger groups will have to wait because we don't want to push so fast, so quickly that we endanger the most vulnerable in our community and endanger our hospital capacity. So we're proceeding in a way that protects both of those. But as far as the larger question, I always say our building is closed, but our church has always been open. The church never stopped ministering. The church of the people have not stopped following Jesus. And so in various contexts, we've been following Jesus and following this mission to grow disciples.
Wow, that's really good. I like that. I really like that. I think that kind of moves us into even maybe asking a question about, for instance, when you guys think about the church of the future, what excites you about the church of the future? And maybe what even scares you? What do you feel a little bit of apprehension? I just don't know.
Yeah. Austin, you want to go again?
Sure. I think potentially the most exciting thing is just, being in physical community once again. And I would venture a guess and say that there are probably many people that are excited about that. On the other hand, I think the thing that probably scares me the most is just the uncertainty. Another way to say that is I'm not sure what to be scared of. I'm just scared of something and I don't know what that is. And so I think there's, a lot of uncertainty here as to what things might look like in the next month, 2 months, 3 months, or who knows how long. And that, that's a little scary. And, it'd be great if things went back to the way they were before, but who's to say if or how that'll happen.
Yeah, really, really good point. Almost the darkness of the unknown is a little bit frightening for the future of the church. Yeah. Joey, what are your thoughts? What do you think?
Actually, the one thing that I'm really excited about is sort of the uncertainty of what the future holds.
Okay.
COVID forced us to adapt in ways that we never thought we would be able to adapt. I mean, there are 80-year-olds on Zoom conferences playing Bible trivia games. If you had told me that was going to happen like 6 months ago, I would have laughed. There's no way that anything like that's going to gain traction. And yet we were able to adapt. So that sort of excites me, that the church has shown its ability to be resilient and to adapt. And that bodes well for the future. What sort of scares me is that the future continues to change. And will the church continue to be resilient and continue to adapt to that changing future? I'm not sure, because honestly, I'm sort of tired of adapting. I've kind of reached my limit of adapting, and I just want some consistency, and yet we're
Yeah.
not getting the consistent. And
Yeah.
part of my desire for consistency is like what Austin was saying before, like going back to what was before. I just want to go back to what I was comfortable. And yet, what if the future doesn't ever go back completely, like Austin was saying? What if it permanently, certain things permanently change?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
adapt to that.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about this, I'd love to hear what you guys think. The future of the church, to some way, as one kind of Christian leader, Kerry Newhoff, he writes, the future of the church will never go back from being digital again. It will carry a digital presence. There are hundreds, thousands of people, even that have been watching our community here in Loma Linda, that are across the world. Some of our viewers who are watching tonight, you're in the Philippines, you're in Korea, you're in the Caribbean, you're in Dakota, you are all over the world. You're Eden in the Philippines, here, Grace in Redlands. Hey, I love this. Michael Broomfield, you're saying you're in the hills of Judea, of Beaumont. I like that. Sylvia in Ecuador. So I think the future of the church will have a strong online presence for those churches who really want to engage in that space. And other churches will be left behind in the sense that they're going to focus so much on that local community, they're going to forget there are people who are eager and wanting to hear from you from all places around the country and the world globally.
And having said that, there is still a robust need for local ministry.
Yes.
People are going to always want to meet in person with other people, right? Because whenever I've been to some socially distanced gathering, naturally people start to sort of clump together, even though we all know we need to be separated. Sometimes people, so we have this desire to be with people, but I totally get what you're saying, Philip. There are some strong benefits to this online ministry that we don't want to lose.
Yeah.
We've learned some things that we don't want to lose those lessons.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, listen, the local space is going to always have a place. You know, I remember as a family, as a young boy, being blessed by my local church when we were in need as poor students in Andrews University in Michigan, the Christian university my father and mother and brother and sister all went to school. And the local church there, Pioneer Memorial, Thanksgiving, came over with Thanksgiving baskets, right? There is a need for a local community. Greta here, Dawson says, hey, please increase the outreach ministry. Several have lost their jobs. There's no money to pay rent and meet their daily needs. And if you're locally here in the Loma Linda area, we want to hear about those needs. Our outreach team is eager to help. They've been helping. Some have been homeless. We've been doing that weekly feedings for the homeless. Individuals coming into our office talking about, hey, I've lost my job. Can you help with rent? Absolutely. I don't have a place to stay. Absolutely. We're here to help. So that's important, Pastor Joey. I think that's a great point. That's a great point.
Yeah.
Now, Joey, you talked also about communication. I think, Austin, you might have a couple questions, but I want to also invite those of you who are watching, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, we'd love to facilitate as best we can an answer to you tonight. So if you have a question, you're watching from anywhere around, we love to hear any questions that you might have. And Judy, we haven't forgotten you in Apple Valley. I see that. Don't forget us in Apple Valley. Really appreciate you and your dear husband and family for being part of our church. So excited for that.
So as some of you might know, this Q&A session will air again tomorrow. And at that point, the sermon that Pastor Joey has prepared will have also aired. So I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions regarding that sermon. So first, Joey, I know that you talk in your sermon about listening when we are angry, and that can be a really tough thing to do. So would you talk a bit about that, or elaborate, or maybe even give us some of your own experiences? How do you listen when you're angry and, kind of take a step back?
So when I've been practicing, what I've discovered is that's really hard. It's really, really hard to listen when you're angry, when your emotions are firing, right? So what I've discovered is that actually heading off that train before it gathers steam is really the best way to listen when you're listen when you're angry. You actually have to start seeing that you're getting angry and sort of head off that train so you don't keep getting angry, right? And that's still hard to do, but once you've become fully angry, I mean, there's nothing going in. At that point, you're just ready to fight, and you're down for the fight, and you're riding those emotions out until the end. But if you can sense that you're starting to get angry and you become aware of that, that's really the best way to be able to listen before you get angry. Which is why in the sermon we sort of talk about triggers, right? And the more we're aware of what types of things trigger us, that's when we can sort of head off that train. Like personally, one of my triggers is loss of control. So if somebody sort of takes control over me, or for example, my daughters, who I hope aren't listening in, they're in bed right now. If one of them fights me for control, there's one of my daughters that also loves to have control. If they fight me for control, I know that's one of my triggers. And so I have to be aware of what she's doing and be able to step back from that situation and say, oh, I see what's coming down the road. And I'm not always able to stop that train, but the more I practice that, the easier it becomes. It's really easy though.
That's really good. That's really good.
Has that ever happened to you, Philip, where you've seen the train coming and
I embrace the train far too often. Oh man, no, I really resonate with that because I've been trying to practice self-reflection quite a bit more in my life as I've been getting older and older. 33 now, can you believe it? And I've noticed when I'm really observant with how am I feeling right now? Why am I feeling this? Where is this coming from? I'm able to stop myself from getting to that space. But I also, just to be real honest with everybody, I have experienced unmitigated just spewing out of my mouth in arguments with my wife where I kind of continue the fight because my emotions are gone. Her emotions maybe are a little bit risen too. And I've experienced that enough times to recognize that wasn't helpful. And I think some of this experience in how to do conversations and conflict well also comes from being willing to recognize when you failed, how did I go through that and how can I improve for a future experience? The problem is sometimes you don't have a second chance, right? I've spent time with young adults who said, that church member said this to me and I never went back to church again. Sometimes there's just one shot and you blow it and it's like, or I've been in conversations with young adults, hey, she broke up with me and she doesn't want to talk to me again. She blocked my phone, blocked my social media. And so those are really tough spaces when someone doesn't want to listen to you again and kind of close the door to even a conversation happening at all. And so you just have to say, how did I learn, or what can I learn from that failure and not repeat this again in the future? It takes some humility to recognize your faults. So that's a big one. I remember spending some time with a couple I was counseling. The husband would just drive off in the middle of an argument. You know, Austin, you've been married, what, a year now? Almost?
A couple of years.
Oh, a couple of years. Okay, just kidding. You know, this couple had just gotten married a year into it, and he would just take off in the car, and she was like, "Is he coming back? Is what's happening?" You know, and she would be in this panic. And so I had to teach them safe ways of saying, "Okay, we're in this argument. This is a conflict. Energy's really high. Can you tell her I'm going to go for a walk around the block, as opposed to I'm leaving the car and just sending so much distance between the two of you?" And communicating you're needing a little bit of space for a moment. That's been a little bit helpful, just communicating in the conflict your need for space so that you can air out your emotion to the inside of the car. You know, if you get into your parked car, you go around your house or a neighborhood. Yeah, those are two things. Austin, what about you, man? What do you think are a few ways for that, for you in your life, or just some advice?
You know, anger can be a tough thing to deal with, certainly. And like Joey said, you know, kind of heading off the train before it gets to the destination there can be really important. And like you said, Philip, you know, there are times when I have also embraced the train and what's coming, and it is never helpful to just be angry and then be in such an emotional state where you say things you don't mean, and it just creates bigger issues at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But why does it feel so good?
It feels very good in the moment.
You know, in the moment, it feels like, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are other healthier ways to deal with anger than to take it out on somebody else. And, you know, we have to deal with anger at some level because we all get angry sometimes. I think it would be unrealistic to imagine a place where we never got angry. I don't think that's really possible. So there have got to be healthier ways of dealing with that than taking it out on someone else.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what is so good is that you've gotten something off of your chest. And I think there are a few ways that are healthier expressions of getting things off of your chest that, you know, as pastors, we know, but sometimes we don't practice those in our home. We may preach about it, right? But really, the moment I get on my knees and I pray and I'm like, Lord, what is happening? Why is this going on? And I have this conversation with Jesus, my emotions start decreasing. My adrenaline starts going down, and I start walking through what Greta here is reminding us here. I love this. Greta Dawson, she says, repenting daily, sanctifying our lives, instant forgiveness, memorizing scripture. Absolutely. I think in those moments of anger, it's hard to get to that place, but when you're practicing this lifestyle of, Lord, I need your grace. I didn't do well in this conversation today. And you're just kind of in that repetition of that lifestyle. I think that might be a good one too.
I love what Greta says, because actually many of our triggers are connected to our own pattern of sinfulness. You know, each of us have certain sins that we're more prone to. So those sins actually spark our reaction, our strongest reactions. That's why the one situation that may trigger Philip, for example, may not trigger Austin. And what may trigger Austin may not trigger me, because we each have our own individual sinfulness. Some of us struggle with pride, and some of us struggle with anger or control, like I was talking about. And so that repentance and forgiveness and confession is such a powerful spiritual discipline to moving past those sins. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So I will jump in here with another question then for you, Joey. In your sermon, you also talk, you know, some about listening and the desire to be heard. When we get into conflict, which inevitably happens to anybody and to everybody, people all want to be heard. And often everyone then talks at the same time because they want to be heard, and then no one ends up being heard. And I would imagine that everyone has experienced that at some point or another. So would you talk a little bit about, how to strategize around that, how to be heard, but also how to listen effectively? Because that's something that many people, including myself, struggle with at times, is listening well.
Yeah, especially when, just like we talked about, our emotions are heightened, right? It gets even harder. Something that's helped me, again, this is very challenging. I practice this, but am not always successful in doing this. But something that's helped me is to get curious, to try to mentally get curious in the moment. Like, try to really understand what's going on with this person, especially if they're responding in a way that's different than I thought they would respond. For example, if I said something and then their response is way stronger than I would have expected, in that moment, instead of getting offended at what their response is, I try to get curious. What's going on with them that they responded in a way that I would not have expected, right? There's an author, Mark Goldstein. He writes a book called Just Listen, and he talks about that most conversations are actually 3 different conversations that are happening. The first conversation is the fact conversation, and that's actually what most of us think the argument is about the facts. Like, one person thinks that this happened, another person thinks that this happened, right? One person thinks, my wife thinks I didn't put the dishes in the dishwasher correctly. I think I did put it in correctly. It's a discussion about facts. And really at that point, it's usually the answer lies somewhere in between those 2 perspectives, right? In that third perspective. But that's what we usually argue about, is the facts. But beyond just the facts, there is the conversation about the feelings. How does what I perceive happen make me feel? How does that make me feel? And the feelings conversation is actually way more important than the facts one, but we don't have, that's the silent conversation that's happening in the background. So part of getting curious is try to figure out how did this make them feel? Like when it didn't seem like I put the dishes the correct way, how did that make my wife feel? And why did it make her feel that way? Maybe the reason why she's responding so strongly is because she's asked me to do it some way before. And by me not putting the dishes in that way, it's almost communicating to her that I don't prioritize what she asked me to do, right? So she's feeling hurt, she's feeling abandoned, she's feeling neglected, right? The feelings conversation. And then the third conversation he talks about is the identity conversation. What does this situation say about me? And that really is at the core, right? Because if I have to interpret the facts a certain way, then it says something about me. This is one of the biggest challenges with this conversation about race. Because when we have this conversation about race, a lot of times white people will take what Black people are saying about race and say, well, I'm not one of those people that actually see Black people that way, or I'm not the ones that passed the Jim Crow laws, or I never had a slave, right? So it's almost like you saying this is saying something about me. You're accusing me, and you're saying that I'm a bad person when I see myself as a good person. Identity conversation. So all 3 of these conversations are happening at the same time, but a lot of times we're just arguing about the facts. And some people they advocate that, let's just stick to the facts. The problem is the conversation is rarely just about the facts.
Yeah.
The feelings and the identity.
Yeah. I agree with that. I'm gonna share. I'll be the first to share. Victor Saigon says, "Hey, what are a few examples of your triggers?" I mean, the moment I get into an argument with my wife, usually it's not about the facts. I'm like, "Hey, your tone was just a little bit harsh," and she's like at the fact level. Wait, we're not talking about that. That's not, you know,
Yeah.
and we have this disagreement. It isn't even, I'm not even talking about the facts anymore. I'm about like the emotions are, what about the, you know, and I don't know if we recognize that enough in the public square together. It's like, I don't appreciate how this went down. Not just that it happened, but in the way it happened, the emotional experience. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Victor, that question, I already shared that one of my triggers is loss of control, but I'm going to try to be open here, be vulnerable with all of you here. The reason why I've discovered that loss of control is one of my triggers is because how I see myself, the identity question, right?
Mm.
How I see myself is someone that always is prepared and
Mhm.
always has things under control. That I'm the type of person that over prepares for everything. And so when something comes in that throws me off, that makes me look like I'm not prepared or not ready for it, it challenges this identity that I have, that as the person who's always prepared. And that's what triggers me. That sets me off.
Wow.
That's why I feel this need to be in control. So that's one of my triggers.
Mm.
That is a great question, Victor. I think one question that people should all try to answer for themselves. And when I think about my own triggers, it's similar in some ways to what Joey and Philip have shared. Sometimes I feel when I get into an argument that I and whoever this other person may be are just not on the same page. And that frustrates me when I'm trying to complete a task, so to speak, within, the confines of a conflict, and it's just not happening. And, that is because often we are having different conversations. And it's important. A couple of things that I try to do, or two things specifically that I try to do, is when I am not understanding something, which makes me angry sometimes, I always ask for more information. If I don't get it, I want more information so that hopefully I can understand it. And then at the point at which I believe I've come to an adequate understanding, I will try to reflect what I've heard. So if I've heard someone say something, I will say it back to them. If they say, well, I feel this way, I will say, am I hearing you correctly that you are feeling this way? And then that way they can say, yes, that's what I try to communicate to you. Or no, the message isn't quite getting there yet. And that sounds tedious because it is a little tedious, but it can really change, the way people conflict if they're just willing to ask for more information and then make sure they're understanding the information.
That's really powerful. Go ahead.
I think of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of his habits, I think it's habit number 5. If you haven't read the book, those of you who are watching, fantastic book. He says, seek first to understand before you are understood. And the reason behind why that is because it deflates an individual's tension, animosity towards you, or frustration when you take the time to listen to them. And I think you did a great job of explaining that in your sermon with the story of you and the airline steward, airline agent. That was really a vulnerable moment for you to share. It just deflated my frustration when she listened to me, and I felt like I could engage with her again.
Yeah, it's really been powerful when moments when I expect the other person to react strongly back to me or attack me back when I'm attacking, when they take time to listen to me and it just makes all that anger go away so quickly. It's amazing how quickly anger can come on and also go away if treated the right way.
Yeah.
You know, Agrita also talked about how past trauma can be a trigger. And that's actually one of the points that Randy makes last week. He talked about how our past experience, our past scars can be a part of what triggers us. I love it's actually a book that we've been reading as a staff is Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. I have it right next to me right now. And in it, the author talks about how he talks about hypersensitivity, how when some point is touched over and over and over again, eventually it becomes super sensitive, right? So when we have past trauma, we become hypersensitive to that trauma. So, yeah.
Yeah. I love this story Kenneth Bradley is sharing us, who's watching from YouTube. Austin, maybe you could read that for us just briefly.
Yeah, so Kenneth Bradley shares that he was in a lift with an African-American driver, and he's white. And their conversation started off a bit rough, but they began to talk about COVID-19, and he told her that he trusts in God's promise in Psalm 91:11. And then in his following comment, he says, wait for it, she had Psalm 91 tattooed on her wrist. Imagine that.
That's awesome.
So Psalm 91:11 says, for he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. We then boarded across racial divides. Wow, that's powerful. That's a real conversation in a real life setting. Thanks, Kenneth, for sharing that.
And when we have these conversations, it shows that we have more in common than divide us. There's more that connect us together than does divide us, which is why it's so important to have these conversations with each other.
Yeah. Now, I know, Austin, you shared about spiritual conflict, and in particular talking about the Sabbath. And if our viewers would like to see that, you can see that on our YouTube channel on the videos with this evening's home church sermon. And you talked about differences people might have about the Sabbath, and Joey talking about conversations and communicating those in a loving, kind, and helpful way. What do we do, guys, when we're facing spiritual conflict, maybe in our family, maybe in the church, and there's just a disconnect over spiritual issues? What do you do? How do you go across the bridge to find each other in a good and meaningful way?
Well, you know, it's a tough question to answer, because I don't think there is just one end-all answer. I think a lot of that can really depend on the case, because, you know, people's conflict resolution styles are different. The issue itself can widely vary. But as we've already talked about this evening, as Joey talked about in his sermon, I think it's just important to listen. You know, I think that's really where everything starts, because if you don't understand why someone does what they do, you're already starting off at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because Joey references a professor at Fuller in his sermon, Dr. Scott Cormode, who is someone I've also taken classes from and found to be an excellent professor. And in a leadership class, one of the things he says is that we judge ourselves by our intentions and we judge others by their actions.
Wow.
And when you get into that habit, that can become really damaging, because your intentions are always good.
Yeah.
And we almost never assume that about other people, and especially when it comes to their spiritual practices. So, you know, listen, and then just be gracious. Have some grace if some people see certain spiritual or theological issues in a different light than you do.
Wow.
Now, Austin, what about, for instance, we think about, let's talk about a real thing that's occurred in our church, you know, the issue of women's ordination, for instance. It seemed like people have listened to each other, but they still persist in, I'm right, this is my stake, you know, and that's just an example. What do you do at that point when there's this persistence to want to have different views on this? and this affects how churches might be run even?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I am suspicious as to whether or not people have really listened. You know, I think, like Joey talks about, everyone just wants to be heard, so everyone talks about it all the time. But I'm not sure I fully believe that everyone really listens. I think there are some who do, but I think there are probably a lot who don't.
Mm.
And again, that's where it starts. If we're going to have an honest and constructive conversation and come to some sort of solution, we must listen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where everything has to start. And I don't want to get too deep into this one particular issue during this live stream, but aside from listening, it's also important to get into the text and realize what's there, but also realize what's not there. So, we could talk a long time about that, but I'll pass it off to you, Joey. I don't know if you have any thoughts, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I what you said was powerful. Listening and seeking to understand, because when I've taken the time to hear why certain people do certain things for the Sabbath, it actually expands my view of the Sabbath. I talked to one person who said that he has an outfit that he only wears on Sabbath, and I didn't understand this, so I asked him why, and he shared that it's because putting that outfit puts him in mindset that Sabbath has begun. This is not anything. This is a special day. This is something different. And I thought that's beautiful. That's really powerful. We try to do that in our family in a different way. We try to start the Sabbath together by having a special meal, by having family worship where we sing together. That's how we try to create the specialness of the Sabbath. But hearing how other people practice it sparks ideas for us. But I think the challenge is when we expect everyone to do it exactly the same way we do it, just because it works for us, right? That's where then we go into the realm of prescribing the Sabbath for other people.
Now, what about when you feel like it's beyond just a trivial conversation, but it feels as though it's a salvific issue? Darren Grabner, he gives a good point. He says, hey, if it's not salvific topic, then just change the subject. That's a good piece of advice. But what do you do when you feel as though it's one of those issues? This is a big deal. I know I get parents that'll come to mention something to me, and they'll say, my child is not paying tithe. I don't feel like they're being a good Christian. How do I help them pay tithe? That maybe that's not that big of an issue, not a salvific one, but what do you do when it's at the magnitude like that? How do you go through that type of a conflict?
That's a tough question. So I'm going to ask Austin to go.
I know I'm you guys a little bit here. I know. Sorry.
No, that's all right. When it comes to people's salvation, those can be really, really tough conversations to have, especially if you feel like you're talking with someone or about someone that might be there in the gray area, so to speak. The truth is, I generally don't get too stressed about others' salvation because it's not my business; it's God's business. And there's a text that is cited often, I think, out of context, but we find it in Isaiah 55, like 9 and 10, around that area, where he says, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And when we read that text in context, it's actually God talking about his mercy and our lack of mercy. And I think God is a merciful God. And, it's important to have conversations about salvation sometimes, but also realize his ways are not our ways. Where we might choose not to be merciful, God almost always chooses to be merciful.
Mm.
And I suppose we can take some solace in that fact.
Mm.
That's really good. That's
I
really
like that. I like
good.
that.
Yeah. I think what makes this topic really difficult is that it means a lot to us. And any challenging conversation is challenging because it means a lot to us. The example that you gave about not paying tithe, that obviously means a lot to that person, that their child is not paying tithe. So because of that, it we have a lot of emotions tied into it. But I would just ask myself, what is the best way, if I really want them to pay tithe, what is the best way that I have to motivate them to do that? Because none of us can force anybody to do anything. No matter how much I care for you, Philip, I can't force you to do something. I can't force you to pay tithe. I'm sure you pay tithe, but I can't force you to pay tithe if you're not paying tithe. No matter how much I care for you, I can't love you into it. So what can I do? The one thing that I can do, and this is going back to Chris Voss, the hostage negotiator, is listen. I can listen. Because when I listen to you, Philip, you brought this up earlier. When I listen to you, it it's almost like magic. It makes you want to listen to me because I've shown that I care about you. Right? So if I really want my child who's not paying tithe to pay tithe, I listen to them. I hear out their point of view. I try to understand where they're coming from, because then I can communicate in a way that's actually going to connect with them.
Yeah.
Because if I'm talking about one thing and I think, oh, they're not paying tithe because they're using their money for something else. That's what all my arguments are going to be about. But what if they're not paying tithe because they don't support the church? They are paying their tithe elsewhere. They are trying to do something else with that tithe. I'm not saying any of those things are good, but they may have other reasons for that we don't understand. So when we listen, we're able to learn something, and when we learn something, then we're able to also motivate and move someone else.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two levels to this, because the one level is you don't know if they're paying tithe, but are you even willing to engage in the conversation? Hey, what do you think about tithe paying? Or is it, I don't think you're paying your tithe, and you're the child and you're hearing that, like, and then there's that other conversation that you're really going at, Joey, which I think is great. It's just like, listen to them. Hey, tell me, what's going on? Why is that a hard thing for you? Or why are you struggling with this? And you can really potentially help them. If it's like, I'm stressed about this, I might be losing my job, and I just feel like I need to hold on to everything. And, there could be so much that could be gained from that listening experience.
Yeah.
I want to just go to one more question that one of our listeners has. This one's from Marianne Fisher, and she says, what do you do when your son or daughter has called you names? How do you react to them?
Well, I don't have kids, so this time, Joey, I'll defer to you.
I have a 1-year-old. She's not calling me names yet. How about in your youth pastor and kind of associate pastor role, Austin? There's got to be some wisdom you've got there, brother.
Philip is not letting you off the hook.
I guess not. Oh man, that's tough. Like I said, I don't have my own kids yet, but there have certainly been situations where there have been peers or other people who, have gotten into it with, and sometimes things are said that aren't very nice. And when you're in a position of authority and power, I think it's really important to not drive that point home, because you can do that. You can stand there and say, I'm the parent or the boss or the team captain, and drive that point home very hard. But again, I think it just goes right back to listening. Why are you exhibiting this behavior, and how can we get to a place where we can be on the same team again? I think in a situation like that, given the information that the question presents, that's probably the route I would choose to take.
Wow. That's good. That's really good.
All right, Joey, father of two, about to be preteen girls.
Yeah, I'm sure more name calling will happen as they get older. For me, so name calling isn't one of my triggers. So I can see why it would trigger somebody, but it's not one of my triggers because it's not part of my pattern of sin. But
I'm gonna try that out on you this night, Joey.
Yeah, obviously, nobody likes being called bad names, but it doesn't set me off like other things. Definitely can. But so if it did set me off, though, the question that I would ask myself is why? Why does this bother me so much? Why does it bother me? Beyond the fact that, we could, on the surface level, we could say, well, they're being rude. I don't want my children to grow up to be people that are rude or mean to other people, right? But why does that bother me so much? Because if our anger just flares up a lot, it's not just the fact that our kids are being rude. It's what that says about me, what that says about them, right?
Yeah.
The fact that my kids are out there saying rude things reflects on me as a parent, possibly, right? So what does that say about me, and what does that say about them? So understanding that, there are these authors, I don't remember their names, but they have a book called Red Zone, Blue Zone. And they talk about how most conflicts, our reaction to most conflicts are more about us than they are about others. Wow. So when we understand ourselves, and that's really what the passage that that I preached on this past Sabbath, or this Sabbath, we'll be preaching on this Sabbath, is about, is that really my anger and my frustration that comes out of the conversation is not about what they're doing. It's actually about what I'm doing, because they might be doing they might have done the exact same thing to somebody else and they wouldn't respond the same way. So that shows that it's more about me and what's going on inside of me. So trying to understand that even before the conversation happens is important.
It's really good.
I'll jump back in here briefly because Marianne, I can see you have provided us with further information here. You say, please remember he's a special needs son. Oh, wow. And that certainly adds some layers that aren't present in other situations. And to that, I would say, I am not properly educated or knowledgeable enough to answer your question adequately, I don't think. But perhaps, if you want to talk to us individually later on or something, we may be able to point you to someone who is far wiser than I am.
I would advocate for one position potentially, and that's unfortunately the more difficult one, and that is in all the education I've had, working through my doctorate now and talking about the spiritual development through the ages and children, and talking about adolescence and everything I've read. You have to take the long game approach when it comes to children and parenting, and especially the teens, and just even in particular when it's in special needs. And the long game approach is the harder one, and that is building a spirit of compassion, because you have a long period of time to bring about potential change. And that potential change occurs through your ability to be deeply compassionate towards them, recognizing they are a teen, they're an adolescent, or then you think of the special needs child and you say they have not yet fully developed. They do not completely understand what they're doing. I need to be more gracious. And in that space, it's like you have to win them over by your love, by your compassion. Now, you also are a parent, so there needs to be this space of like, hey, these are the boundaries. These are the ground rules. You can't just be walking over everything. There are rules in this house. And those conversations need to be had as well. And that's vital. I think when a child doesn't understand authority and doesn't understand obedience, that's a challenging future. But being disciplined in prayerfully saying, God, I know I have some time in this. This isn't my last time I'm going to talk with them. This is my child. They're going to be in my home for a little bit longer. Give me the grace to know how to work through this. And then model good behavior to your children. If they see you, and this, now we're just talking in general. We can kind of take off Marianne off of the bottom there. In general, I think modeling is the most important thing I can do for my child. And Father's Day, which just happened a little bit ago here in America, one quote was, how can you show your child the best gift? Love their mother deeply, because by you loving them, they will learn how to love her, how to love you, because you're modeling this behavior. So that's one thing. And then the other, I would say also, is setting certain boundaries that are safe. And that is when a child begins to break those, they escalate, scream, yell at you, curse at you. Billy, I see that you're really, really angry. I'm going to step out of the room because I recognize you're not dealing well with this. We'll talk about this in a few minutes, maybe again. And you try that a couple times. If they still lost it, say, we're going to have to talk about this tomorrow in a way that's kind and loving, because that's not what we do at our home. And then if they're still not working with that, then I would say, like Austin, I think seeking some professional help would be good. Having a season of real prayer, and even if they're willing to pray with you, I know that's sometimes painful, but sometimes children are willing and recognize, if they've been raised in a Christian home, like, okay, Mom, Dad, I recognize we need to pray through this. Okay. And if you can almost deflect it sometimes to recognizing there's a bigger thing going on, Satan is trying to bring a wedge between us in this home. And son, daughter, I'm recognizing, there is something more bigger here than just you and me. And I believe Satan is really trying to work to divide us in this space and time now. I don't know how you feel about this, but I really would love to pray with you. And I'd love to hear your prayer as well. Could we take a moment to do that? That may not happen. That's a real big ask, right? But it's possible. And so maybe today, before we finish, maybe we could pray for Marianne and just pray for all the families here tonight and tomorrow who are watching, just that God would bless them. Maybe Joey, if you'd be up for that, I think that would be huge.
Yeah. I mean, Marianne, my kudos go out to you, because it's not easy to be a parent of a special needs child. I've had some close friends who have had special needs child, and those parents, you parents, are doing really exemplifying God's love in the way that you care for your children. So definitely we will be praying for you and for your family.
Yeah.
Shall we take a moment now to pray?
Yeah, let's do that.
Dear Heavenly Father, we want to pray for our families tonight. This whole journey through COVID has been challenging for a lot of people, but particularly families learning how to navigate a space, be in a tight space for long periods of time together. We've learned a lot about each other and about the ways that our triggers cross over onto each other. And hopefully in that journey, we've learned how to work through conflict and to be healthier in our relationships. But it's not always easy. Family is such a beautiful thing. It's one of your greatest ideas to have a community that loves you and supports you through anything, to have that love and support for children as they grow up. But that journey is not easy, especially if we have a special needs child. And so we want to pray tonight, especially for Marianne, for all parents who have special needs children, that you continue to support them, that you continue to give them wisdom and give them patience and help them to learn about themselves, learn about their children, so that they can exemplify your love to them and grow them in the way that you would like their children to be grown. Bless them is our prayer in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen.
Hey, thank you, both of you, pastors. Appreciate your time. I know our viewers were blessed. Those of you watching, we just want to tell you thank you so much for being part of this journey with us. We just pray God's very biggest blessings. And thank you so much for those of you who asked. Marianne, love you, care for you and your family, your girls and your son. Praying for God's very best for everyone watching across the world. We'll see you next week. Same time, same place. Take care.